Wargamers. Today I want to talk about Games Workshop's preview for how vehicles are going to work in 8th edition 40K. Before we do that though, I just want to say thanks for watching. If you like this video, if you like any of my other videos, go ahead, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell as well. That way you don't miss any of my upcoming 8th edition videos. Alright, so the preview today, there's a link in the description below if you want to follow along, but it's pretty simple. We didn't learn a ton more about how vehicles are going to work beyond what we already knew as far as them moving away from armor values and having a normal stat line. But the things that we did learn are pretty important. They're subtle but important. So let's go through this piece by piece. There's a lot to unpack and kind of tease it apart and see how it's going to influence how the game plays. All right, so basically they give us an example of an annihilation barge and basically show us how that stat line is going to look and use it as a guide to kind of go through some of these big changes. So let's do the same thing. The annihilation barge, the new stat line is movement 12 inches, weapon skill hitting on 6+, ballistic skill hitting on 3+, strength 5, toughness 6. Yes, it has strength and toughness. Wounds 8, attacks 3, leadership 10, and a 4-up save. So all those have some pretty important consequences, and let's go through those. So first and foremost, it has strength and attacks, meaning that it can fight in close combat. You don't have tank shock anymore. You just have close combat attacks that it can perform just like any other unit. So if it charges, it will go first. If it gets charged, it will punch back. And the narrative for that is basically just tries to run over people, right? And that's fine. In some ways, I think this makes a little bit more sense. I always kind of wondered why vehicles just kind of sit there in close combat, why they couldn't do anything offensively in close combat, and this addresses that. So I'm happy about this change. Actually, I think this makes sense. And it's deadlier than tank shock, especially against fearless armies. This can still do something, whereas tank shock just really didn't have that much application. Having close combat attacks has application and really allows vehicles to interact with other armies in a new way, and I think that new way is better in a lot of ways. So that's cool. Of course, they have toughness and wounds now and an armor save, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But getting through the rest of the profile here, they have a movement characteristic. It's 12 inches for the Annihilation Barge, and I think having just that 12-inch movement characteristic helps streamline things instead of having different rules for how fast vehicles move. They're suggesting that vehicles aren't going to have any special rules for how they move. They're going to act just like everyone else. So that means they have this 12-inch movement, and barring any type of special rule, that's it. Or they can run or whatever too. But for the most part, it's just going to be this 12-inch movement. And that has the associated costs of moving just like it does for any other unit. There's no relentless anymore. Vehicles aren't exempt from that. They still have to take a -1 penalty for moving and shooting heavy weapons. This actually makes them a little bit faster, and it also has less impact on shooting, which I think is fine. I like having a streamlined set of rules for vehicles and shooting. It just makes it so much simpler, and I think probably a solid third of the people that I played against didn't get the movement and shooting rules on vehicles right anyway, so this just alleviates that problem, gets it out the door altogether, and makes vehicles basically not care that much about moving and shooting unless they're firing heavy weapons, which granted, a lot of weapons on vehicles are going to be heavy weapons, but it's not that bad. You can still move your full distance and still shoot a lot of your weapons at a smaller detriment than you would under 7th edition rules, which is cool. I like that. As far as shooting goes, again, relentless isn't a thing. And I think this is a fair trade-off for not having to deal with the costs of moving in 7th edition. In addition, you also have the ability to fire weapons at different targets for vehicles. So yeah, I'll take that. I'll take the -1 to hit modifier in exchange for being able to target other things and move more and not feel the penalty quite as much. So that's cool. I think this will make vehicles, again, a little bit more viable. Moving into the assault phase, because they have strength and toughness and attacks now, if they are locked in combat, just like any other unit, that means if they try to move away, they can't shoot, right? So a vehicle under 7th edition could just move out of the way and move out of combat and shoot as normal. Under 8th edition, if a vehicle has been assaulted in the turn prior, it has to move out of combat, but if it does so, it can't shoot, just like any other unit, according to this preview. So unless they have a special rule that negates that, vehicles, if they're assaulted, are not going to be able to fire the following turn. Now, they still get to fire Overwatch, potentially, right? I mean, if they act just like any other unit, vehicles can fire Overwatch now. But that's not as good as just being able to shoot normally, right? So there's a cost there, and that's not great. Additionally, well, I guess the flip side of that is that vehicles can now prevent other units from shooting by charging them. So if you have a Rhino that's going to go against a bunch of infantry, you can use that Rhino to kind of tie up that unit and prevent them from shooting next turn if they remain in combat and have to move away from the Rhino. So, you know, it's a double-edged blade. The vehicles can now participate in combat and inhibit your opponent's ability to shoot, but they can also be inhibited in the same way, which is complicated. I'm not sure how good that feels in terms of a narrative sense, and I think, again, it's going to make vehicles more sophisticated in the game. It gives you more options with vehicles, and I'm not sure how well that's going to play out. More options is good, but it also means that they're subject to a few more caveats, which, you know, might mean that vehicles just get tied up in combat all the time, even if you don't destroy them in combat. If you can prevent them from shooting, then they're not doing much good. Additionally, it's unclear how vehicle transports will work. If you have a vehicle that moves into combat, what happens to the crew inside? Do they get to assault too? Do they have to disembark and then assault? Can you assault out of a vehicle? Things like that. I have a feeling that you probably can assault out of vehicles, given what we heard about deep striking yesterday. If you didn't see the preview, they give the example of a Moloch, I think, or was it a Trigon? I don't know. One of the two big Tyranid bugs. I think it was a Trigon, and they had the subterranean assault role where you could deploy that underground and put another unit of Tyranid infantry or Tyranid troops in there, and they can assault out of that deep strike option. So if you can assault out of deep strike, you probably can assault out of a vehicle, is my guess. So that makes all vehicles more viable for assault armies too, if that's true. So that'd be cool. I think a big weakness with this new stat line is that they have leadership. Vehicles didn't used to have leadership. They just passed all their leadership checks. Now they do have leadership, and with the new morale check, battle shock mechanic, that means that vehicles in squadrons, as you lose vehicles within that squadron, you may lose more vehicles. Granted, the value here for this Annihilation Barrage is 10, which is good, but it's not impervious to losing vehicles on a morale check. So that's a problem for things like piranhas that you want to take a bunch of in a squadron, right? If you lose one, you could potentially lose a few more just from fear, and that doesn't sit quite perfectly with me, just given kind of the rule set that I'm accustomed to. I think it'll be fine in the long run once we get acclimated to that rule set. But again, it undermines some of the positive changes that they're making for vehicles. And maybe that's just a balancing factor. but it also makes me a little concerned about how viable vehicles actually are going to be. Along that line as well, we're looking at toughness 6 with 8 wounds and a 4-up save, which, toughness 6, super easy to wound. Fire warriors can take care of that, no problem. What is going to make it more durable is the fact that you have to go through all 8 of those wounds, and it has armor save. Granted, even a pulse rifle probably is going to take a few points off that armor save, so maybe you're looking at 5-ups or 6-ups for your save, so it's not going to play a huge role, but it will mitigate a few of those shots. It will, save 1 or 2 of those potential wounds. And so, it's easier to wound, but harder to kill in some ways. And of course, something that's really interesting in this example is that it doesn't have any variable traits. The examples that they gave us right at the beginning of the discussion of what 8th edition was going to look like suggested that variable traits for vehicles were going to be fairly common, if not ubiquitous. Well, they're definitely not ubiquitous. The Annihilation Barge has no variable traits, meaning that it maintains its stat line throughout its lifetime. So maybe what we'll see is some variable trait on the weapon in terms of how much it can shoot or something like that. But as far as this basic stat line, there are no variable traits, which I think is interesting. Who knows what that means in terms of how many vehicles are going to be influenced directly by variable traits, and how many are not. But at least the Annihilation Barge looks like it remains relatively robust throughout its life cycle, which is good for some of these lighter vehicles that don't have a ton of wounds or very high toughness. It means that they're going to actually be more viable, whereas these vehicles that have tons of wounds, really high toughness, it makes sense that you're able to actually get something out of them, but then eventually they'll deteriorate as you strip away wounds. In this case, if it started losing abilities right away, you wouldn't actually get very long with it on the battlefield at full capacity. So that's something to keep an eye out for. All right, so yeah, I think that's about it. That a pretty concise preview. We didn't learn a ton, but those little nuances in terms of strength and toughness, variable traits, movement, and how vehicles are affected by moving and shooting and assaulting, all are really important implications for how the game is going to be played. Overall, I think there are a few positive things in here for vehicles and a few negative things in here for vehicles, and probably how that actually affects how vehicles play is going to depend on the vehicle. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and of course, happy wargaming.